The pilot never saw what hit him. Lieutenant Shigeo Fukuda's Nakajima P-43 Hayabusa fighter disintegrated at 4,000 feet over Port Moresby on April 22, 1942. One moment he was executing a standard diving attack on what appeared to be an American fighter below him. The next moment, a single projectile struck his aircraft's engine cowling. The impact was unlike anything Japanese pilots had encountered before. Not the small-caliber punctures from 50-caliber machine gun rounds. Not the scattered damage pattern from multiple 30-caliber hits. This was something else entirely. The engine block shattered. Metal fragments tore through the firewall into the cockpit. The propeller assembly separated from the engine shaft. Fukuda had perhaps 2 seconds to recognize that his aircraft was no longer flyable before it entered an uncontrolled spin. He did not bail out. The wreckage was found 3 days later by Australian ground forces advancing through the Kura jungle northwest of the airfield. When intelligence officers examined what remained of the Hayabusa, they noted the entry wound in the engine. A hole approximately 37 millimeters in diameter punched clean through the cylinders. The projectile had continued through the engine, through the firewall, and into the cockpit area where it had struck something, perhaps the pilot himself, before exiting through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Allied intelligence report filed that week noted the kill, but attributed it to standard fighter armament. No one yet understood what the Japanese were facing. The American fighter that had destroyed Fukuda's Hayabusa was a Bell P-39 Airacobra, and it carried a weapon that defied conventional fighter aircraft design. A 37mm autocannon, firing directly through the propeller hub along the aircraft's centerline, with a bore so large that the pilot sat on top of the weapon rather than behind it. Japanese fighter pilots in the Southwest Pacific Theater during 1942 operated under a set of assumptions built from years of combat experience. They understood American fighters. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk mounted 6 50-caliber machine guns in its wings. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat carried 4 or 6 50-caliber guns, also wing-mounted. Both aircraft followed conventional design philosophy. Guns installed in the wings, engine in the nose, pilot behind the engine with the propeller spinning in front. These configurations were predictable. Japanese pilots knew the effective range of 50-caliber weapons, roughly 800 to 1,000 yards maximum, with lethal effect declining rapidly beyond 400 yards. They understood the ballistic characteristics. The rounds were fast, relatively flat shooting, and capable of penetrating light armor and aircraft skin. But they were not explosive. They did not carry high explosive warheads. They damaged through kinetic energy, and sometimes through incendiary effects, if the rounds happened to strike fuel tanks or other flammable materials. The Japanese Navy's Mitsubishi A-6M0 and the Army's Nakajima P-43 Hayabusa were designed with this threat in mind. Both aircraft sacrificed armor protection for performance. The Zero carried no armor plate behind the pilot's seat in its early variants. No self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof windscreen. The design philosophy emphasized speed, maneuverability, and range over survivability. Japanese naval aviation doctrine, refined through years of training and combat in China, held that a skilled pilot in a maneuverable aircraft would not be hit. The best defense was not to be where the enemy's guns were pointing. This doctrine had proven effective against Chinese opposition, which possessed limited air capability and outdated aircraft. It had proven effective in the opening months of the Pacific War, when Japanese naval aviators achieved air superiority over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Allied pilots in those early battles found themselves outmatched by Japanese aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange their own fighters. By April 1942, when the P-39 Airacobra began appearing in combat over New Guinea, Japanese pilots had developed considerable confidence. They had fought American pilots in P-42s and found them capable but not superior. The P-40 was rugged and could absorb damage, but it was slower than the Zero in level flight and could not match Japanese fighters in a turning fight. American pilots had learned to use diving attacks and avoid dogfighting, but this defensive posture suggested weakness rather than strength to Japanese aviators. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was never supposed to be a frontline fighter in the Southwest Pacific. The aircraft was designed in 1937 by Bell Aircraft Corporation as a high-altitude interceptor for the United States Army Air Corps. The original specifications called for a fighter capable of reaching altitudes above 30,000 feet to intercept enemy bombers threatening American cities or military installations. Bell's chief designer, Robert Woods, and his engineering team made several unconventional decisions. The most radical was the placement of the Allison V1710 engine behind the pilot rather than in the traditional nose position. This mid-engine configuration was virtually unprecedented in American fighter design. The engine sat directly behind the cockpit, connected to the propeller by a 10-foot drive shaft that ran under the pilot's seat and through the nose of the aircraft. This arrangement offered significant advantages. It moved the engine's weight closer to the aircraft's center of gravity, improving maneuverability and stability. It allowed the nose to be used for armament rather than being occupied by a large radial or inline engine. It provided better visibility for the pilot, who sat high in the aircraft without an engine cowling obstructing his forward view. And it created space in the nose for a weapon that would have been impossible to install in a conventional fighter. The engineering team decided to mount a 37mm autocannon in that nose space, firing directly through the propeller hub. The weapon was a modified version of the American T9 cannon, itself derived from a French Puteaux design. The barrel extended forward through the hollow propeller shaft, with the breech mechanism and ammunition feed located in the forward fuselage. The propeller spinner was designed with a large circular opening to allow the cannon barrel to protrude slightly. This configuration meant the cannon fired along the aircraft's exact centerline, unlike wing-mounted guns, which required convergence settings and created different impact points depending on range. The nose-mounted cannon's point of aim was its point of impact at any distance. The pilot simply aimed the aircraft at the target. Where the nose pointed, the cannon fired. The 37mm round was enormous by fighter aircraft standards. Each projectile weighed approximately 1.3 pounds. For comparison, a .50 caliber machine gun round weighed roughly 1.7 ounces. The 37mm shell was nearly 12 times heavier. More importantly, it was not a solid projectile. The rounds carried high explosive charges with impact fuses. When the shell struck a target, it exploded. Bell engineers installed two .50 caliber machine guns in the nose alongside the 37mm cannon, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. 4 additional .30 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, 2 per side. The P-39's total armament was formidable on paper: 1 37mm cannon, 2 .50 caliber machine guns, and 4 .30 caliber machine guns. But the cannon was the defining weapon, the feature that made the Airacobra unique among American fighters. The aircraft entered production in 1940 and began reaching Army Air Corps units in 1941. Initial reception was mixed. Test pilots praised the aircraft's handling characteristics at low and medium altitudes. The tricycle landing gear, another unusual feature, made ground handling easier than conventional tailwheel fighters. The car door-style entry to the cockpit was far more convenient than climbing onto a wing and squeezing into a cramped space. But high-altitude performance disappointed. The Allison engine's single-stage, single-speed supercharger limited power output above 15,000 feet. The aircraft that was designed as a high-altitude interceptor performed poorly in the role it was meant to fill. Above 20,000 feet, the P-39 was sluggish and underpowered. Its rate of climb decreased dramatically. Its top speed fell off. Enemy bombers operating at 25 or 30,000 feet could simply outclimb the Airacobra and operate beyond its effective ceiling. The British Royal Air Force ordered several hundred P-39 seconds under Lend-Lease arrangements in 1941. British pilots tested the aircraft and rejected it for combat operations over Europe. The altitudes at which Luftwaffe bombers and fighters operated made the P-39 unsuitable. The RAF sent most of their Airacobras to the Soviet Union instead, where they would eventually prove more successful in the low-altitude ground attack role on the Eastern Front. The United States Army Air Forces found themselves with hundreds of P-39 seconds that were unsuitable for high-altitude combat but available for deployment. When war broke out in December 1941, commanders needed fighters anywhere they could get them. The Southwest Pacific Theater, where Japanese forces were advancing rapidly through New Guinea and threatening Australia, needed air reinforcement desperately. The P-39 seconds were shipped to Australia and New Guinea. The first P-39 squadrons arrived in Australia in March 1942. The 8th Fighter Group, which had evacuated from the Philippines after the Japanese invasion, received Airacobras to replace their lost P-40 seconds. The 35th Fighter Group, newly arrived from the United States, was equipped with P-39 seconds from the start. Both units deployed to Port Moresby, New Guinea, where they would face Japanese naval and army air forces attempting to isolate Australia and secure the southern approaches to the Japanese defensive perimeter. American pilots trained on the P-39 received standard fighter tactics instruction, but the 37mm cannon required specific techniques. The weapon carried only 30 rounds of ammunition, loaded in a drum magazine. This was a severe limitation compared to the machine guns, which carried several hundred rounds each. Pilots were instructed to use the cannon sparingly, firing short bursts of 1 to 3 rounds only when they had a clear shot at a high-value target. The cannon's rate of fire was approximately 150 rounds per minute when functioning properly, meaning it could empty its entire ammunition supply in 12 seconds of sustained fire. But sustained fire was not recommended. The weapon generated significant recoil, and continuous firing could affect the aircraft's stability and the pilot's aim. The proper technique was to line up the target, fire a brief burst, observe the results, and maneuver for another attack if necessary. The ammunition itself was expensive and relatively scarce. Each 37mm high-explosive shell cost significantly more to manufacture than machine gun rounds. Supply officers prioritized shipments carefully, and pilots were reminded that wasting cannon ammunition was unacceptable. The weapon was to be used against enemy aircraft when a killing shot was likely, not sprayed indiscriminately. Training emphasized the cannon's unique characteristics. Unlike machine guns, which damage through multiple hits, creating cumulative destruction, the 37mm round could destroy an aircraft with a single hit if it struck a critical area. The engine, cockpit, wing root, or fuel tank were all potentially fatal impact points. The high-explosive charge would detonate on impact, sending fragments through the target's structure and creating catastrophic damage. Pilots were taught to aim for the fuselage or engine rather than the wings. A 37mm hit on a wing might blow a hole in the structure and damage control surfaces, but the aircraft might remain flyable. A hit on the engine would destroy it immediately. A hit on the cockpit would kill the pilot. A hit on the fuselage near the fuel tanks would likely cause an explosion or fire. The P-39's other armament complemented the cannon. The two nose-mounted 50-caliber machine guns carried 200 rounds per gun. These were synchronized to fire through the propeller arc using mechanical interrupter gears that prevented rounds from striking the spinning blades. The synchronization reduced the effective rate of fire slightly, but the guns remained lethal weapons capable of shredding aircraft structures and killing pilots. The four wing-mounted 30-caliber machine guns were less effective. Each carried 1,000 rounds, but the smaller caliber meant they were primarily useful for harassment or for attacking unarmored targets. Against Japanese fighters, which lacked armor protection, the 30-caliber guns could inflict damage if enough rounds connected, but American pilots quickly learned to rely on the 50-caliber guns and the cannon for serious combat. The P-39's performance at the altitudes where most combat occurred over New Guinea was adequate. Most engagements happened between 8,000 and interleave, 15,000 feet, well within the Airacobra's effective operating range. At these altitudes, the aircraft was reasonably fast, reaching speeds of over 350 miles per hour in level flight. It could dive quickly, reaching speeds approaching 450 miles per hour before structural limits became concerning. But the P-39 could not turn with a Zero or a Hayabusa. Japanese fighters, optimized for maneuverability at the expense of everything else, could outturn any American fighter then in service. American pilots in P-39 seconds, like their counterparts in P-40 seconds, learned to avoid turning engagements. The doctrine was simple: use speed and altitude advantage to attack, make one pass, and extend away from the fight if the target was not destroyed. Never try to turn with a Japanese fighter. This hit-and-run tactic frustrated Japanese pilots, who preferred extended dogfights where superior maneuverability could be exploited. American pilots refusing to engage in turning combat appeared cowardly or unskilled. But the tactic was effective. It minimized American losses and allowed pilots to survive long enough to gain experience. And it created opportunities for the P-39's cannon to be employed under ideal conditions. Diving attacks where the target was unaware, allowing the American pilot to line up carefully and fire a precise burst before breaking away. The first combat encounters between P-39 seconds and Japanese fighters occurred in March and April 1942 over Port Moresby and surrounding areas. Japanese forces were conducting regular bombing raids against the Allied airfield, escorted by Zero and Hayabusa fighters. American and Australian fighters rose to intercept these raids, and air battles developed over the airfield and the approaches to it. Japanese pilots initially treated the P-39 seconds as they treated P-40 seconds. They recognized them as different aircraft based on appearance. The tricycle landing gear and the mid-engine configuration gave the SCURV, Airacobra, a distinctive profile, but assumed the armament was similar. The intelligence briefings Japanese pilots received identified the P-39 as mounting machine guns in the nose and wings. This was not incorrect, but it was incomplete. The 37mm cannon was either not recognized by Japanese intelligence officers examining photographs and reports, or its significance was not understood. On April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Boyd Wagner of the 8th Fighter Group engaged a formation of Japanese fighters near Port Moresby. Wagner was already an ace, having shot down multiple Japanese aircraft in the Philippines before the American withdrawal. He was flying a P-39D that day, armed with the standard 37mm cannon and machine gun complement. Wagner dove on a Hayabusa from above, achieving the speed and position advantage that American doctrine emphasized. He lined up behind and slightly below the Japanese fighter, which apparently had not seen him. At approximately 200 yards range, Wagner fired a short burst from his cannon. One round struck the Hayabusa's engine. The explosive shell detonated on impact. The engine literally disintegrated. Pieces of the cylinder block, crankshaft, and connecting rods scattered in all directions. The propeller separated from the drive shaft. The aircraft's nose pitched down violently as the engine's weight shifted and fragments damaged the firewall and forward fuselage structure. The Japanese pilot, almost certainly Lieutenant Fukuda, had no chance to recover. The aircraft entered a spin and crashed in the jungle. Wagner did not observe the crash. He had already broken away from the engagement, following standard procedure, and was climbing back to altitude to position for another attack. He reported destroying one enemy fighter, but did not describe the specific damage he had observed. His gun camera footage, if it existed and survived, would have shown the catastrophic effect of the 37mm hit. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the following weeks, similar incidents occurred. Japanese aircraft were destroyed by single hits that caused disproportionate damage. Engines exploded, wings separated from fuselages, Aircraft broke apart in mid-air from what appeared to be minor impacts. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with P-39 seconds and returned to their bases reported that American fighters carried more powerful weapons than previously encountered, but they could not identify what those weapons were. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant, though it developed gradually. In the early weeks of combat over New Guinea, Japanese fighter pilots maintained their aggressive tactics. They attacked Allied fighters and bombers with the same confidence they had shown in earlier campaigns. But as losses mounted, and as patterns became clear, doubt began to emerge. Japanese aircraft were being destroyed by attacks that should not have been fatal. A single burst of fire from an American fighter, lasting only a fraction of a second, could destroy a Zero or a Hayabusa completely. Pilots who had been hit by 50 caliber machine gun fire before and survived damaged aircraft limping home with punctured fuel tanks and shot-up control surfaces found that hits from P-39 seconds were different. There was no limping home, there was catastrophic destruction. Lieutenant Yoshio Uki of the Tainan Air Group survived an encounter with a P-39 on May 8, 1942, during operations over the Coral Sea. His Zero was struck by what he initially thought was a 50 caliber round. The impact location was the left wing root, where the wing joined the fuselage. But instead of punching a hole through the wing's thin aluminum skin, the projectile exploded. The explosion tore a section of wing skin and completely away, exposing the internal structure. The main wing spar cracked but did not fail. Control cables were severed. The aileron on that side became partially unresponsive. Uki managed to maintain control and disengage from the fight, nursing his damaged Zero back to Rabaul. The flight took over an hour, during which he had to compensate constantly for the asymmetric lift and drag caused by the damaged wing. When ground crews examined the Zero, they found fragments of the projectile embedded in the wing structure. The fragments were identified as coming from a high-explosive shell, not a solid machine gun round. The size of the fragments and the damage pattern suggested a projectile much larger than 50 caliber. Intelligence officers were notified. They examined the damage and filed a report noting that American fighters were apparently using cannon armament, not just machine guns. But this information did not circulate widely. Japanese intelligence in the Southwest Pacific theater was strained and fragmented. Communication between different air groups was limited. The Tainan Air Group's experience did not immediately reach Army aviation units, which operated under separate command structures. And even within naval aviation, the information was treated as one data point among many, not as a critical intelligence finding requiring immediate distribution to all combat units. Japanese pilots continued to encounter P-39 seconds without understanding the specific threat they represented. The cannon's existence was gradually becoming known, but its characteristics, the caliber, the explosive ammunition, the nose-mounted configuration remained poorly understood. Most importantly, Japanese pilots did not modify their tactics in response. They continued to attack American fighters using the same aggressive, close-range techniques that had proven effective against P-40 seconds and F-4Fs. The full understanding of what Japanese pilots faced came not through intelligence, reports or combat debriefings, but through accumulated loss. Through the spring and summer of 1942, Japanese air units operating over New Guinea experienced attrition rates that exceeded what their commanders had anticipated. Aircraft failed to return from missions. Pilots who had been considered skilled and experienced simply disappeared. The formations that left Rabaul or Leh in the morning returned in the afternoon with fewer aircraft than they had started with. Some of this attrition could be attributed to normal combat losses. The Allied defenders were improving their tactics and coordination. Anti-aircraft defences around Port Moresby were strengthened. Fighter direction improved as radar installations became operational, and controllers learned to vector interceptors more effectively. But the nature of specific losses, aircraft destroyed by what appeared to be single hits, suggested something unusual was occurring. Japanese maintenance personnel at forward bases began documenting damage patterns on aircraft that returned from combat. Zeros and Hayabusas showed different types of damage depending on which Allied fighters they had encountered. Damage from P-40s typically consisted of multiple small-caliber holes, sometimes dozens of them scattered across wings and fuselage. The aircraft looked like they had been peppered with buckshot. Structural members were cut, control cables severed, but the damage was distributed. Damage from P-39 was different. Aircraft struck by P-39 fire showed large, irregular holes with torn and twisted metal around the impact sites. The holes were not clean punctures but ragged tears where metal had been blown outward by internal explosions. In some cases, entire sections of fuselage skin were missing, blown away by a single explosive hit. Wing spars showed fracture patterns consistent with blast damage rather than simple penetration. One Zero that returned to Leh in June 1942 had been struck in the tail section by what the pilot reported as a single round. The impact had blown a hole roughly 1 foot in diameter through the vertical stabilizer. The edges of the hole were peeled back and twisted. Fragments of the projectile had continued through the tail and struck the horizontal stabilizer, cutting control cables. The pilot had managed to land the aircraft using differential throttle and very careful coordination of the remaining control surfaces. When armourers examined the damage, they found fragments of a shell casing embedded in the tail structure. The fragments were measured. The diameter suggested a projectile of approximately 37 millimeters. This was significantly larger than the 12.7 millimeter 50 caliber rounds that American machine guns fired. It was in fact closer to the caliber of light anti-aircraft cannons that Japanese forces used for ground defense. The implication was clear. American fighters were mounting cannon armament, but the specific configuration remained mysterious. Japanese intelligence officers assumed the cannons were wing-mounted, following the same pattern as the machine guns. Some reports speculated that the Americans had developed synchronized cannon that could fire through the propeller arc, though the mechanical challenges of synchronizing a low rate of fire cannon were considerable. No one initially understood that the cannon fired through the propeller hub itself, that the barrel extended through the hollow propeller shaft, that the weapon was aimed by aiming the entire aircraft. This configuration was so unusual, so contrary to standard fighter design practice, that Japanese analysts did not consider it as a possibility. When reconnaissance photographs of P-39 were examined, the cannon barrel protruding through the propeller spinner was visible, but analysts who were not looking for it specifically did not recognize its significance. The tactical implications of this intelligence gap were severe. Japanese pilots continued to engage P-39 at close range, where the cannon was most effective. They closed to within 200 or 300 yards, the range at which their own 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns were effective. At these ranges, American pilots flying P-39 could hardly miss. The cannon's centerline mounting meant no convergence was necessary. Point the nose, fire, hit. By late 1942, combat reports from New Guinea consistently mentioned the destructive power of American fighter armament. Japanese pilots used terms like explosive bullets and heavy cannon in their debriefings. But understanding what they faced and being able to counter it were different matters. Japanese fighters had no armor protection. Adding armor would reduce performance, eliminating the maneuverability advantage that was their primary defense. The design philosophy that emphasized agility over protection could not be easily reversed. The P-39 Airacobra served in the Southwest Pacific Theater throughout 1942 and into 1943. As newer American fighters became available, P-38 Lightnings with their twin-engine design and superior high-altitude performance, and eventually P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, the P-39 was gradually relegated to secondary roles. But during the critical period when Allied forces were defending Port Moresby and beginning their counter-offensive through New Guinea, the Airacobra was the primary American fighter available in sufficient numbers. The aircraft's combat record in the Pacific was mixed. It was never a great fighter by the standards pilots applied to thoroughbred designs like the P-51 or the British Supermarine Spitfire. It could not match Japanese fighters in maneuverability. Its high-altitude performance remained poor throughout its service life. Mechanical problems with the propeller drive shaft and engine caused maintenance headaches. The 37mm cannon was prone to jamming, particularly in humid tropical conditions where moisture affected the ammunition feed mechanism. But when the cannon worked, it was devastating. American pilots who learned to use it properly, closing to short range, firing brief bursts, breaking away immediately, achieved kill ratios that compared favorably to pilots flying other types. The psychological effect of the weapon on Japanese pilots who witnessed its results was significant. Aircraft did not simply catch fire or lose pieces of wing. They exploded. They disintegrated in mid-air. The violence of the destruction was shocking even by combat standards. Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front, who received thousands of P-39 seconds through Lend-Lease, used the aircraft extensively and achieved remarkable success with it. The altitude band where most combat occurred on the Eastern Front, between ground level and 15,000 feet, was ideal for the P-39's performance envelope. Soviet pilots praised the cannon's effectiveness against German fighters and ground targets. Several Soviet aces achieved high kill counts flying Airacobras, and the aircraft became one of the most successful American fighters in Soviet service. But in the Pacific, the P-39's legacy is more complicated. It was the fighter available when no better alternative existed. It performed adequately in a role it was never designed for. And its unique armament configuration, the 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, created a capability that Japanese forces never fully understood or effectively countered during the period when P-39 seconds were frontline equipment. Japanese aviation intelligence eventually compiled detailed information about the P-39's armament. By 1943, technical manuals describing Allied aircraft included specifications for the Airacobra that accurately noted the cannon's location and characteristics. Japanese pilots received briefings that warned them about the weapon's destructive power and advised maintaining distance when engaging P-39 seconds. But this information came late, after the period of maximum confusion and surprise had passed. The broader lesson that emerged from Japanese encounters with the P-39 was not about a specific weapon or aircraft. It was about intelligence failures and the dangers of incomplete understanding. Japanese forces in the Pacific consistently underestimated Allied technological capabilities and industrial capacity. They assumed Allied aircraft would follow conventional design patterns. They did not anticipate unconventional solutions like the mid-engine fighter, with a cannon firing through the propeller hub. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Japanese intelligence failed to anticipate the proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that made American anti-aircraft fire so deadly in the latter part of the war. They did not understand the full capabilities of American radar systems until those systems were directing fighter intercepts and anti-aircraft fire with devastating accuracy. They underestimated the speed with which American industry could produce not just more aircraft, but better aircraft incorporating lessons from combat. The P-39 Airacobra was withdrawn from frontline service in the Pacific Theater by mid-1943. The aircraft was transferred to training roles, to air defense units in rear areas, and to Allied nations under Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union continued operating P-39 seconds until the end of the war, and some remained in Soviet service into the early 1950s. But in the theater where Japanese pilots first encountered the aircraft, where the 37mm cannon destroyed Zeros and Hayabusas with single hits, the Airacobra's combat career was relatively brief. The pilots who flew P-39 seconds in combat over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands moved on to other aircraft. Some transitioned to P-38 Lightnings. Others flew P-47 Thunderbolts when those aircraft arrived in theater. A few eventually flew P-51 Mustangs in the final year of the war. When interviewed after the war, most expressed mixed feelings about the Airacobra. It was not a beloved aircraft the way the P-51 was beloved. It did not have the fierce reputation of the P-47, but it was the fighter they had when they needed fighters, and it had capabilities that surprised the enemy. Japanese pilots who survived the war and were interviewed decades later remembered the P-39 specifically. They remembered aircraft exploding from single hits. They remembered the fear that developed when engaging a fighter that could destroy your aircraft with a single burst. Some described changing their tactics, trying to attack from angles where American fighters could not bring their nose guns to bear, extending attack runs to longer ranges where the accuracy of the cannon decreased. But mostly they remembered the realization that their assumptions about American aircraft were wrong. The Americans did not simply build more of the same fighters. They built different fighters with different capabilities. And Japanese intelligence, stretched thin across the vast Pacific theater, struggling with language barriers and limited access to captured equipment, failed to provide accurate and timely information about these capabilities. The story of Japanese pilots encountering the P-39's 37mm cannon is a small chapter in the vast Pacific War. It did not determine the outcome of major battles. It did not shift strategic balance. But it illustrates something fundamental about that conflict: the asymmetry in information, in technology, and in industrial capacity that characterized every aspect of the war from the first day to the last. Japanese forces fought with skill and determination, but they fought without complete understanding of what they faced. And that incomplete understanding, multiplied across thousands of tactical encounters, contributed to the cumulative disadvantage that made Japanese victory impossible. The P-39 pilots who fired that 37mm cannon in combat were not thinking about intelligence failures or strategic implications. They were trying to survive, to shoot down enemy aircraft before those aircraft shot them down. The cannon was simply the weapon they had been given. When it worked, it destroyed targets efficiently. That was enough. The psychological impact on the enemy, the confusion it created, the intelligence gap it revealed, those were effects they could not observe from their cockpits at 12,000 feet over hostile jungle. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.